Okay, here we go. So this is exciting. First of all, I'm in the passenger seat, which rarely happens. I don't let just anybody drive my Pathfinder. Secondly, I drove over 3 hours to get here. Who are we with? This guy. Do I call you Colonel Jetly in this interview? Do I call you Rakesh in this interview? What do I call you?
Rakesh is perfect. If I can call you Michelle.
You can call me Michelle.
And you can call
I've
me
been
Rakesh.
okay.
That's fair.
I honestly have to tell you, this gentleman to be one of, not if the smartest men I've ever met in my life.
Jeez.
People.
You haven't met too many people then, I guess.
I've met quite a few. So we're in Ottawa. I've decided to let him drive because he knows where he's going and I don't. To give people a backstory of why I wanted to do this interview, Rakesh and I have known each other for a while, and like I said, he's extremely brilliant. He is the chief psychiatrist of the Canadian Forces.
That's right, yeah.
Has worked extensively with post-traumatic stress disorder, and in celebrating Canada's 150th, I wanted to talk to Rakesh about how far we've come in terms of mental health treatment. But the first thing I want to ask you is Colonel. So I was trying to explain to my kids that I was interviewing you and how amazing you are, and they were like, what's a colonel?
So I'm an Army officer, and so in the military, generally, you divide members of the forces into non-commissioned members, which are sort of private corporals, master corporals, right up to chief warrant officer. So they're the guys that do the heavy lifting, the fighting, in the ships. They're the ones that sort of make the ships go, this kind of idea. Then you have the officers that generally have they're more sort of in charge, leadership positions, this kind of thing.
Did you have to start? Like, where do you start?
No, you start if you've sort of done university, you usually start as an officer. Not always. But,
okay.
And it's an interesting point because some militaries, like the Israelis, everybody starts off as enlisted, and they feel that until you've really done that job, you can't really appreciate the whole organization until you've done.
What do you think of that?
I think it's a valid point. I mean, not that I necessarily want to go back in time and do some of those things, but I think there is kind of a walk in my shoes to get what I'm doing kind of philosophy.
And I also want to point this out. You can see he's in his civilian clothes. And I think that was kind of a conscious decision because I want people to know how human and amazing you are. And I sometimes feel like people who work in uniforms, especially in military, people don't see the human end of them.
Yeah.
And I think that was really important for me. For people to see that.
There's a point, because we are husbands and fathers and friends and all of that. And sometimes putting on a uniform is a persona that's, it's helpful many times, but other times it sort of diminishes from the totality of who we are. So I agree with that.
Let's talk about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder and how far we've come.
Thousands and thousands of years going back to Roman and Greek times, there is clearly evidence that people got impacted psychologically by trauma and stress, fear, those kinds of things. But it's really well understood from World War I on. And of course, at that time, they thought it was shell shock. They thought that people get sort of, from all the bombings and explosions, their brains get shaken a little bit, and that's what causes.
They wanted a physical answer.
They wanted a physical answer, which kind of makes sense. And then they very soon after that, they realized people that weren't blown up still had the same kind of reactions, and it really wasn't strictly about being blown up, but the idea of stress, and fear is sort of an understatement, but sort of being overwhelmed. So this is the U.S. Embassy, probably the most guarded building in Ottawa. You can sort of see it there.
Really?
Yeah, look at it.
Why would it be the most guarded?
Well, unfortunately, our friends, the U.S., are targets for lots of protests and things like that. So you can just see how,
Even before Trump?
Oh, well before. And so in the late 90s, it really became something that, hey, we need to really take a look at this. And the difference between Canada, Australia, and the U.S. is those two countries had Vietnam, we didn't. So in some ways, they were in some ways 10 years ahead of us, but it gave us a fresh start. So we're sort of interesting when you look at that. So we had Rwanda, Somalia, former Yugoslavia, some of those missions, people having difficulties psychologically after that. In Halifax, where I was in 2000, we had just had the Swiss Air plane crash. We had a plane crash from from New York, the Swiss plane, and our Navy ran into trouble because there's a recovery process, pulling dead bodies out of the ocean and things like this. So in many ways, we cut our teeth on Rwanda, Somalia, all of those. Swiss Air, Rideau, the Prime Minister's house.
Where is the Prime Minister's house?
That was just back there.
What?
Yeah.
I feel like we've come leaps and bounds in recognizing mental health. I feel like we've come so far in recognizing that it is equal to physical health.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we're there. But I also feel like a lot of people still feel like, oh, we don't take care of our soldiers, and once they come back, they're left to deal with the trauma.
No, I think it's interesting. I mean, the two parts to that, like the leaps and bounds. I think someone once said, the debate whether medicine is science or is it an art, this kind of idea, and somebody put it best by saying it's science practiced as an art. But the bigger picture, though, I think the risk of sort of military sort of PTSD and things like that is that it gets politicized, and somehow if somebody has a psychological injury after a war, it's somebody's fault. Somebody's done something wrong. If somebody falls down, breaks their leg, we don't always think that way for combat and things. So part of what needs to happen is we need to make that shift and just sort of acknowledge that the physical injuries that occur are part of what happens when you take young men and women, put them in dangerous places, and the psychological injuries are the same. I think depression worldwide, and a lot depends on how you measure it. It's the largest cause of morbidity and mortality in the world now. It's surpassed. And part of it is because a lot of these tropical illnesses and stuff are on their way down. I think, it's something like, every 40 seconds somebody in the world commits suicide, right? So it's about 880,000 people a year complete suicide in the world. And most of those are suffering depression. So depression really is, it's real, like we've talked about. It's not.
Are you trying? Is the World Health Organization or the people in that circle that you're in that's really on the? I call you like the founding people, the pioneers of trying to revolutionize how we see it. Like it's like diabetes. Is there something we can give people?
It's
vaccine.
It's an excellent question. The more research is needed, and so part of the problem is that, like, when they do the math, 500,000 Canadians are going to miss work this week because of stress-related problems, right? It's a $51 billion problem in our GDP.
This is how he gets people's attention.
But it's less than 5% of the research funding for health research in our country, right? So it's fascinating, when you look at sort of where cancer has gone and heart disease and even HIV/AIDS. I trained in the days, back in Toronto when, AIDS sort of first came out. It was terrifying, but within 10 years they went from, the kiss of death to, it became a chronic illness. So you threw money at a problem, you threw researchers at a problem, and they really, really did incredible things. In fact, I think last year, the AIDS ward in San Francisco actually closed because they don't need it anymore, right? So people are living like Magic Johnson, still alive after all these years.
Right.
He always
talks about basketball. Can you tell? He's a bit of a Raptors fan.
But the Raptors that's one of my favorite things to do. But I enjoy sort of things like Bell Let's Talk, things like that, where we can make a difference in Canada. And Canada's poised. We really, when you leave Canada and you speak to other countries like Australia and things, they really admire what we've been doing in terms of setting the benchmark for lots of these things.
Yeah, we are admirable. Yeah. I think we are. We still have lots, there's always room for improvement. Yeah. In seeing what you've seen, in dealing with what you've done, and dealing with the people you've dealt with, is there certain people that are more at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress? And there are a difference between those two things. And what are those risk factors?
Well, I think there are definitely risk factors. The general ones, population-based, are things. Actually being female puts you at a slightly higher risk.
Really?
In general, having a mental health illness of another nature puts you at higher risk. Something called poor coping skills puts you at risk. The problem is that there's a whole bunch of things that put you at elevated risk, but that risk isn't so high that, we shouldn't send Michelle there because she's going to get it for sure.
So we can't do any kind of screening, is what I'm getting at, where you
very
can say,
difficult.
you're going to develop a mental illness.
That's right.
We're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet. We could say, because your uncle had it, you're at higher risk. Because your dad had it, you're at higher risk. And because of that, the natural thing is, that's why you have a population-based approach. You have a population-based approach, just like you have for smoking, heart disease, those kinds of things. You try to get everybody some education, some awareness, some skill building. And we start our stuff, our road to mental readiness, our resiliency training, coping skills. We start that right at basic training. You do?
Yep. And how long have you been doing that?
That's since about almost 10 years now. Maybe 8 years. I mean, the urgency of some of this resiliency training started with the war. So we started off, Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So we started off giving people pre-deployment some of the skills that would help them in stressful situations. So borrowing from special forces, Navy SEAL stuff, sports psychology, performance psychology, things like visualization, self-talk, goal setting.
Which, by the way, I use all of this stuff that he says in my parenting, in my life.
Absolutely.
Like, it's amazing stuff.
Yeah. And this is the stuff that, I want taught to kids in school. I don't want it to be military, first responders. It needs to be, forget university, start in high school, because, times are difficult, and it's not about preparing somebody for battle. It's about preparing somebody for giving a presentation in class. It's about, and it's the stuff that athletes have been using for years and years and years. If you think about an Olympic diver that's about to dive, what are they doing? They're closing their eyes, they're visualizing it, they're controlling their breathing, they're saying to themselves, hey, you've done this many times before, you can do this. So we teach, I'll say the kids, I guess we can call them that, we teach them that right in basic training, because if you're in basic training, that's the most stressful thing up until now that you've faced. You're away from home, you're away from your normal supports. And then as their career develops, we give them more and more of this sort of skill building. When they become responsible for the health and the welfare of others, then you inject some leadership aspects to it as well. And it really, the research that we've done up until now, it gives people more confidence in dealing with stressful situations. So just like any kind of skill, you have to train and practice.
That bus is just about running over the
people's feet.
Civilians. You should be the bus driver, Rakesh.
Take the nice wide turns. So here we're coming up to Parliament. And all of that, so
it's so beautiful. It's like Hogwarts.
It is cool. Yeah.
It really is a beautiful city.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, I think it's really interesting because as we're moving along, we're realizing that these so-called mental health illnesses aren't just brain diseases, they're body diseases. So people that have psychological problems also have high rates of heart disease, diabetes, inflammation in the body, joint pains, all of this. So really, there's no such thing as a body disease versus a brain disease. So that's going to be really helpful as we move forward. We're looking at inflammation, all of these different kinds of things. So the best antidepressant may be, a low inflammation diet, and these kinds of ideas, the things people have been talking about for years. The other thing that we're going to have to do, given the numbers that we talked about, how many people are ill, we have to leverage technology, right? So we have to develop apps, serious gaming, online CBT, all of these different kinds of things, because if 1 in 5 people have mental illness, if they all raise their hand and say, I want to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker for one-on-one psychotherapy, we're not going to have the capacity to do that. Look, our Royal Military College kids that are sort of the new generation that are joining, they haven't spoken on the phone in their whole lives, right? I tell the story about Serena, my little one, when my wife forgot her iPhone at home, and they went to the mall, and Serena came back and said, Daddy, I tried to get Mommy to use one of those thingies on the wall that people put money in to talk to people, right? So
my kids didn't know what it was.
They don't know what a payphone is.
I know.
So then we're asking people that, when you're struggling to have, call 1-800 and talk to somebody, or go into somebody's office and sit there and wait, So we need to look at texting, we need to look at apps, we need to look at things, because, and let's say even a young mother that has a couple of kids, maybe 9:30 at night, doing some cognitive therapy online is the most realistic way of reaching her. The third important thing is we've come a long way in terms of treatments, but for treatments, there's still so many treatments, and there's still a piece of trial and error that goes on for antidepressants, for psychotherapy, all of this kind of idea. So the idea of precision medicine, the idea of personalized medicine, the idea of this is you, a 32-year-old person that has this and this and this,
Thanks,
and
I
you
am
have
32.
this type of depression. What's the treatment that's most likely to work for you, right? Whether it's based on a brain scan, based on other kind of factors, based on your genetics, this kind of idea. Can we find that personalized treatment? Kind of like how cancer works, right?
Interesting.
Where you sort of stage the cancer, the type of cancer, this is where it spread, this is where it hasn't spread, come up with the specific sort of chemotherapy cocktail for you. So if we could reduce some of the trial and error, because you're depressed, you're already hopeless, I give you a drug, it doesn't work, or give you a therapy, it doesn't work, and then you say, figures it doesn't work for me because I'm a loser and I'm depressed and nothing's going to work for me. And then we say, let's try another one. So if we could take that trial and error from 3 trials down to 2 or 2 to 1, or maybe even get it right the first time, most of the time.
Well, this is what I love about the military. It's like, okay, Michelle, why are you talking about military? Well, where do you think everything starts?
Yeah.
You guys are the ones that are doing all of the research and development that gets transferred into civilian life.
It should, a lot of it. I mean, in World War I, plastic surgery was basically invented by the military when somebody had facial, so when you have a young kid now that burns their face and has flap surgery to kind of repair things, it was the military that first came up with that. Penicillin, antibiotics, the race for antibiotics got accelerated by World War II. So when we landed in D-Day, we took penicillin into Europe as well, not just the weaponry kind of ideas.
I love that you recognize what needs to be improved.
Yeah.
I think that's critical for people to understand that you, on the research end of things, to help these programs and to build these programs, recognize where improvement needs to happen. And transition is huge. I have so many friends in the military that have now, they've left or retired, or they had post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're back in civilian life, and it is hugely stressful.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And the stuff we take for granted. I mean, finding a family doctor, finding dentists, finding sort of basic things that everybody else has. Remember, when we're in the military, we don't have OHIP, where we have our own federal health system. So it's trying to sort of plug yourself back into a provincial health system is a challenge. And culturally, I mean, it's not right or wrong, but the civilian culture is different than the military culture in terms of work, employment, those kinds of things.
And one of my military friends said, civilians are lazy. I said, I know. The work ethic of military trained personnel is, it's here, and we're all like here.
There's incredible research by Korn Ferry and the HR firm in the States, that high executives were saying that they would look for military experience ahead of an MBA sometimes, depending on the job. It's kind of interesting in the military. There rarely is the I'll try to do it. It's I'll do it. And that's kind of, so this idea of if I get around to it, those kind of phrases don't exist for us. And, the peaceful solutions aren't always possible. And
yes, they are. No, they are.
Yeah.
They are.
And unfortunately, sometimes things happen where young men and women have to go and do these things.
You know what it can all be solved with?
Mm-hmm.
Dance battles.
Dance battles.
Just dance battles.
Yeah. So Putin and Trump on a dance battle? I could see that.
Putin and Trump on a dance battle. We could be joint prime minister, and we really solve both sides of the world.
Wouldn't that be great?
TransCanada Nissan, proud sponsor of MF's Drive-Bys, where satisfied customers are our best salespeople.